The silo stood at the edge of the county road, like a man who had outlasted everything that was ever said about him. It was made of fieldstone, laid without mortar, fitted by hands that understood patience, and it rose from a circle of cleared ground so clean and so flat that the travelers who passed on the road that October morning slowed their horses and looked twice, because 3 years earlier that same ground had been a tangle of cocklebur and thistle, so thick a grown man could lose his hat, walking into it, and not find it till spring. A woman stood at the base of the silo, with her hands in her coat pockets and a ledger book tucked under her arm, and she was watching a drove of hogs fan out across the last frostbitten field, with the unhurried confidence of animals that had been well fed and well kept and knew it. The hogs were large. They were, in fact, the largest hogs most people in Harlan County had ever seen, though they were not yet willing to say so with any admiration in their voices, because admiration would have required them to admit they had been wrong, and that was a currency folks in those parts spent very carefully. The woman's name was Nora Voss. She was 25 years old. She had paid $60 for 60 acres that no one else would touch, and the whole town had found it amusing. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1887, Nora Voss arrived in Caldwell with $31, a borrowed wagon, and the deed to a parcel of land that her uncle Thomas had left her in lieu of a debt he owed her father, who had died owing debts of his own and therefore passed the inheritance along to Nora in the form of that single folded document and nothing else. The document described the land as 60 acres in the southeast quarter of Harlan County, and what it did not describe, what no legal document was equipped to describe, was the way the land looked when you came over the low rise and saw it for the first time. It looked like something the county had turned its back on. The cocklebur grew in mats so dense they'd choked out the old pasture grass entirely, and the burrs caught in everything: your clothes, your hair, the dog's ears, if you were fool enough to bring a dog. There were 2 structures on the property, both past saving, according to anyone who looked: a listing barn with a roof that had given up in sections, and the old fieldstone silo, which everyone agreed was the only sound thing on the parcel, and also by everyone's reasoning, completely useless, since you could not fill a silo if you had no crop, and you could not raise a crop on ground that would not grow anything but cocklebur. The land had changed hands 4 times in 7 years. Each owner had paid a little less than the last. Nora paid $1 an acre, which was the price at the bottom of every calculation anyone in Caldwell had done on the subject. The price that meant this land is not worth arguing over. Hiram Selke at the feed store told her straight out that she'd have done better to sleep in the street and save herself the deed recording fee. A woman named Burkett, who ran the dry goods counter, said to her neighbor, loudly enough for Nora to hear from 2 aisles away, that it was a pity when a person with no family left to guide them made decisions like this, because there was no one to say stop. Nora heard it all. She recorded the deed, paid the $2 fee with money she did not have to spare, and drove her borrowed wagon out to the southeast quarter of Harlan County to look at what she had bought. She stood in it for a long time that first afternoon, the burrs already working into the hem of her dress, and she did what she always did when she was in a place that frightened her, which was to look at it with the part of her mind that did not feel. She looked at the silo. It was 12 feet across and 18 feet tall, and every stone in it was set tight, and she saw at once that whoever had built it had known something about permanence. She looked at the soil beneath the cocklebur mats, and where the mats were thickest, the ground was black. The cocklebur had done what cocklebur will always do if you let it. It had held moisture and rotted its own stalks into the dirt and built something, year after year after year, without any help or encouragement from the people who despised it. She knelt and took up a handful of that soil and smelled it. It was the richest thing she had touched in months. There was an old man who farmed the adjacent 40 acres, a Bohemian immigrant named Pavel Horik, who had come to Kansas in 1861 and had since then watched the land do everything a person could imagine. He came to the fence the second day. Nora was on the property, smoking a pipe and watching her pull cocklebur mats by hand without gloves, which was either brave or idiotic, depending on your prior opinion of the person doing it. He said to her across the fence, without preamble, and in an accent that turned his vowels like coins, "The land will teach you, if you stop shouting long enough to hear it." Nora looked up. She said she was not shouting. Pavel said he knew that. He said the remark was not about her, it was about the county in general. Then he told her about the soil, that the Cocklebur was a nuisance weed, but it was not a poison weed, and a ground covered in it for 20 years was a ground that had been composting itself for 20 years, and the people who had sold it off one after another had never once put a shovel into it to see what 20 years of composting looks like. Nora listened to every word. She filed it next to the smell of that black soil in the part of her memory where she kept the things that mattered. She slept in the barn the first 3 nights, which meant she slept badly under a roof that sifted dust. Whenever the wind moved, which in Kansas, in October, was constantly, she had enough money for a month of careful living, and not a day more. She needed a plan that cost nothing, and produced something quickly, and she lay in the dark those first nights doing the arithmetic by feel, the way you count coins in a pocket when no one is watching. She thought, the soil is good. The silo will hold grain, or it will hold produce. The barn can be repaired, one section at a time, if the repair costs only labor. She had labor. She had 2 hands that had been working since she was 9 years old and were by now rough enough to pull Cocklebur without gloves, as Pavel Horik had observed. What she did not have was seed money, and she did not have livestock, and she did not have time to grow a first crop before her $31 ran completely dry. She lay there in the dark and counted and recounted, and when she had counted her way into a corner from every direction, she came back, always to the one thought that had been sitting at the center of all of it since she had read the deed for the first time. The Cocklebur. She had 60 acres of the finest natural hog rooting ground in Harlan County, and nobody had thought to say so, because nobody in Caldwell had looked at that land and thought anything except that it was a place to stay away from. Hogs, Pavel told her when she came to the fence the following morning, were the oldest farm machine ever invented. They would root, they would till, they would eat the burrs and the stalks and the roots and the grubs, and they would leave behind a ground so turned and so fertilized that you could plant into it that same season. He said his grandfather had cleared a hardwood bottom in Moravia with 8 sows and a boar in 3 summers, and he said it the way he said everything, which was as though the fact were simply a known thing in the world that had been waiting for Nora to catch up with it. He also told her where to find hogs. There was a man 11 miles south, named Dowd, who raised a big-boned, coarse-haired breed that most of the county buyers looked down on because they were slow to mature, and ate enormously, and did not dress out as cleanly as the Suffolk crosses that had become fashionable. Dowd's hogs were not fashionable, they were magnificent. They were 300 pounds at 2 years old, and they had backs like river barges, and they rooted with the single-minded persistence of animals that had been designed by 10,000 years of natural selection to tear the earth apart. Nora drove out to see them on a Tuesday in late October. She stood at the fence of Dowd's lot and watched them for 20 minutes without saying a word, and Dowd watched her watching them, and then he said, "You want a price on the shoats?" "Not a question." Nora said she wanted a price on all of them she could carry in a wagon. Dowd said he had 7 shoats and a bred sow he'd sell for $11 total, because the county buyers had all passed them up again this fall and he needed the pen for his Suffolk crosses. Nora said she had $11 she could put toward it if he would take a note on the remaining $2 she would need for feed until the hogs could fend off the Cocklebur themselves. Dowd looked at her for a long time, with the specific expression of a man deciding whether the person in front of him is the gambling kind or the working kind. He said the note was acceptable. He loaded 7 shoats and 1 bred sow into Nora's borrowed wagon that afternoon. She drove home 11 miles in the dark, with 8 hogs shifting their weight behind her and the wagon groaning at every rut, and she talked to them the way you talk to a thing you are depending on and don't want to alarm. She told them about the Cocklebur. She said it was not as bad as it sounded. By the time she reached the property, it was past 10 o'clock, and the hogs were restless, and the moon was up full and white over the south field. And when she opened the wagon gate and they poured out into that first Cocklebur matted acre, she stood and watched them in the moonlight and felt a thing she recognized, after a moment, as certainty. Not hope, certainty. It was a feeling she had only had 2 or 3 times in her life, and she did not waste it on sentiment. She went to bed. By November, the 8 hogs had turned 4 acres. By December, with the sow having delivered 11 piglets in the barn. Healthy, enormous piglets that Nora's nearest neighbor's daughter, a girl of 7 named Ida Fent, immediately named every single one. By December, Nora had a drove of 20 hogs that was working the south field in rotating sections while she repaired the barn roof with lumber she bargained for on credit against the promise of 6 smoked hams the following spring. She slept better. She kept the ledger in a tin box inside the silo where it was dry, and she updated it every Sunday by lamplight. The arithmetic was improving. It was not yet good, but it was improving. And improvement was its own kind of argument. The town found the whole operation worth discussing through the winter. Hiram Selka said he had heard the Voss girl was running hogs on that Cocklebur ground, which he had always said was the only animal that would live on it, meaning it as an insult, meaning the land was fit for hogs, and hogs were the lowest domestic creature, and therefore this was the natural pairing of 2 worthless things. Others said a person alone, a young woman alone, could not manage a drove of that size on 60 rough acres without hands to help, and that before spring she would be back in town looking for work at the laundry. They said it with the particular confidence of people who have never done a thing and therefore believe it cannot be done. Nora was aware of what they said. Pavel told her, not to wound her, but because he thought she should know the shape of the opposition. She said, "Being right is its own kind of reply." Pavel knocked his pipe against the fence post and said, "Yes, but being fed is a better one." The winter of 1887 to 1888 was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, which was not always in temperature but in persistence. The cold came in early January and sat on the county for 6 weeks, and the wind off the plain drove it into every gap and every structure on every farm, and the farms that had overextended themselves on credit for equipment they had bought at the peak of the land boom 2 years earlier began to feel the weight of that extension in January and February. Prices for corn and wheat softened, and the note holders at the banks in the county seat stopped being patient. This was not Nora's problem, because Nora had no banknote and no grain crop. She had 31 pigs and a bred sow, due to farrow again in March, and the pigs were fat on Cocklebur root, and the grain supplement she'd budgeted down to the pound, and the cold did not trouble hogs the way it troubled wheat. She kept her results to herself. The ledger in the tin box in the silo was a private conversation. She banked her certainty low under the surface, like a coal covered with ash, and let it burn without showing. Pavel Horak came over the fence in February with a crock of his wife's pickled cabbage and the news that Len Gruber, who farmed 3 sections west, had lost most of his winter wheat to ice scald and was going to take a hard loss at the spring market. He said it with regret, not with satisfaction, because Pavel was not a man who took pleasure in other people's hardship. Nora said she was sorry to hear it. Pavel said the loss of a crop was a thing you could survive once if you had reserves, and Gruber did not have reserves. And he looked at her in a way that meant, "Do you understand what I am telling you?" Nora said she understood. She said nothing else about it then. March came in like a slow argument, and the sow farrowed 13 more in the first warm week. And by the time Ida Fent's family came over the fence to see them, Nora had 44 hogs working her acreage in rotating sections, and the sow field, which had been impenetrable Cocklebur in October, was bare-turned earth, black and soft as garden soil. And the first green things coming up in it were not Cocklebur. The rooting had broken the root mats, but the native blue stem grass that the Cocklebur had been suppressing for a generation, rising now in thin pale green threads that looked, in the March light, like a kind of beginning. Pavel saw it from his fence line and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "There it is." He said it the way a man says a thing he has been waiting to see confirmed. In April of 1888, a man came down from Salina. He was a buyer for a hotel provisioner in the city, and he had been told by a Chicago Packers agent that the big-boned Dowd breed hogs out of Harlan County dressed better than their reputation, and could he look at a set? He came to Nora's property by mistake first, because her drove was the largest visible from the county road. He stood at the fence for some time before she came out to speak to him. His name was Calder, and he wore a city coat that had accumulated a day and a half of Kansas dust on it. And he looked at her hogs with the expression of a man recalculating something he had believed was already settled. He said, "Those are Dowd breed." Nora said they were. He said, "How many head are you carrying?" Nora said 44. And he looked at her and looked back at the field and said, "On 60 acres. She said, "Yes," he said, "the ground looks like that." Nora said it had had help. He asked her price per hundredweight, and she told him. And it was a fair price, not a desperate price. And he saw the difference immediately, because desperate people always quoted low first to make sure you didn't leave. And this woman had quoted him a number she clearly meant to stand behind. He bought a commitment on her next 20 finished hogs at that price on the spot, and shook her hand with a formality that said he had just decided to take her seriously, and she had already taken herself seriously for 6 months. So the moment was slightly anticlimactic for Nora and somewhat profound for Calder. The early summer of 1888 brought word that the wheat crop across the central county was going to be the poorest in a decade. The winter ice scald had done the damage that Pavel had predicted in February, and the dry spring had done the rest. Len Gruber lost 2/3 of his crop. 3 other farms on the north end lost more. The grain prices inverted. What the farmers had grown was scarce and commanding a high price in the market, but the farmers who had the grain to sell were the ones who had not grown much of it, and the ones who had planted the largest fields had the largest losses because ice scald is not a respecter of scale. The county sat with this knowledge through June, the way you sit with something that hasn't fully arrived yet, but that you can already smell coming. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The pasture grass on the farms that had not yet recovered from the winter burned to straw in 3 weeks. The farmers who had built their summer grazing plans around that grass found themselves in front of a hard question. What do you feed the cattle through September? They came to Hiram Selke, and Selke did not have answers. They came to the elevator in the county seat, and the elevator had feed grain at prices that reflected scarcity. They stood at fence lines and talked to each other the way people talk when they are frightened and trying not to show it, which is by not saying directly what they are frightened of and instead discussing the weather and what they had heard about prices elsewhere. And all through August and into September, Nora Voss's hogs grew. They had turned the last of the Cocklebur acres by July, and the silo was packed to the lintel stone with stored grain she had purchased in May at the low pre-drop price, and her pasture, the pasture that the hogs had rooted and turned and fertilized and moved off, section by section, all winter and spring, was showing real grass now. And she had taken on 20 head of young cattle in July, because she had feed and ground for them, and because the arithmetic said to. She did these things quietly. She did not discuss them in town. Ida Fent, who had become a fixture at the farm on most afternoons after school, once asked her why she never talked about the farm in town the way the other farmers did at Selke's store, and Nora said, because a coal that's banked low under the ash burns longest. And Ida, who was 7 years old by then, nodded with the complete sincerity of a child who intends to remember that and use it. In the second week of September, a man came to the property in a good wagon with a matching team, and his boots were clean, which in September on a working farm meant he had not come from a working farm. His name was Whitmore, and he represented a land consolidation interest out of Topeka that had been buying distressed farm acreage across the county through the summer, quietly, from farmers who had run out of options and were glad to take what was offered. He said to Nora that he was there on behalf of parties who were interested in the southeast quarter and the adjacent parcels, and that he had been authorized to offer her $120 for her 60 acres, which he pointed out was double what she had paid. He said he thought she would agree It was a generous offer for ground that everyone in the county knew had been difficult to develop. He said the word difficult in a way that was meant to remind her that it was only through luck and stubbornness that she had gotten as far as she had, and that the sensible thing for a person in her position, alone, without capital, without backing, was to take a real offer when a real offer was made. Nora looked at him for long enough that he began to adjust his coat lapels, which is what men do when they are not sure whether they have said too much or too little. She asked him how much the acreage east of her, the Gruber sections, had sold for. He said that was not information he was in a position to share. She said, "I see," and then she said the northeast quarter of her parcel alone carried a silo worth more than his offer, and that the ground the silo stood on had just come through a drought year carrying 44 finished hogs and 20 head of young cattle without buying a pound of supplemental feed, and that she would not be selling. Whitmore said he could see she was a determined woman and that he admired that, and that the offer would expire with the month. Nora said she hoped the drive back to Topeka was comfortable. He tried the county assessor next. He was a thorough man, Whitmore. He filed for a reassessment of the parcel's taxable value on the grounds that the recent improvements, the cleared acreage, the stored grain, the livestock numbers on the county road-facing fields represented a material change in land use that the previous assessment had not captured. He was not wrong, strictly speaking. As a matter of procedure, and the assessor, a man named Croft, who owed his position to no one in particular but to everyone in general, agreed to review the parcel in October. This was the threat Nora had not seen coming, and it was the one that kept her up at night in a way that Whitmore's direct offer had not, because a doubled assessment meant doubled taxes, and her tax reserve was sized for the old assessment, and if the new figure came in high enough, it would open a gap she could not fill with the October livestock sales alone. She lay in the dark and did the arithmetic. She counted every way through it, and some of them were bad, and some of them were worse, and one of them, the one she came back to, was simply fair. She could sell 20 finished hogs before October, at the price Calder had agreed to. She could sell another 10 at the Caldwell market day. She could fill the gap with enough room to bank 2 months of new reserve if she priced the cattle at what the drought market would honestly bear, which was high, because feed was scarce and young cattle were in short supply, and she had both. She could also, the arithmetic told her, sell to Whitmore's interest at a price high enough to clear everything and leave with 5 years' wages in her coat pocket. She thought about that option for a long time in the dark because she was an honest person, and an honest person thinks through every door before they decide which one to use. Then she thought about the black soil under the Cocklebur mats and the silo in the moonlight and the pale green threads of blue stem in the March light, and she was done thinking about Whitmore. What happened next was not something Nora planned, though she was later glad of it. In the last week of September, Len Gruber came to her fence line on a Sunday afternoon, with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has argued with himself for a week about whether to make a particular walk and has finally lost the argument. He said his feed situation was critical, and he had a dozen head of cattle he could not carry through winter, and he had heard. He was careful about how he said this. He had heard she might have ground and grain to spare. He said he could offer labor against feed cost, himself and his oldest boy, through October and November. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the field. Nora thought about what Pavel had told her in February. She said she had ground and feed both and could take his cattle on a share arrangement. She would carry them through winter. He would work October and November, as he had offered, and when the cattle sold in spring, they would split the gain above the cost of feed. She said it plainly, without making him feel the distance between where he stood and where she stood, because that was not a distance she had any interest in measuring. Gruber looked up. He said he had not expected that. Nora said she was not in the business of expectations. Pavel Horak heard about the Gruber arrangement by Tuesday, which was how long anything took to travel in a county that had nothing else to talk about. He came to the fence with his pipe and a look of deep satisfaction that he was careful not to show entirely. He said, "The land will teach you if you stop shouting long enough to hear it." Nora said she remembered. He said he knew she did. He said she was also going to need another sow, because what she had here was a going thing now, and a going thing needs room to go, and he happened to know Dowd had 3 more of the big-bone sows he would sell fair. Nora said she would drive out Tuesday. He said Wednesday, because Tuesday she had Gruber's cattle to receive and the assessor's review had been moved up a week, and she was going to want to be present for that. The assessment review came on a Thursday morning, and Croft arrived with his ledger book, and Whitmore was there too, which told Nora everything she needed to know about whose interests the review had been arranged to serve. Croft walked the property in the way assessors walk property, which is with the expression of a man who is adding numbers in his head and trying to decide how large he can make them before someone objects. He looked at the cleared acreage. He looked at the silo. He looked at the 60 head of cattle and the drove of hogs in the south field, and he wrote things down. Whitmore stood to one side with his clean boots gathering a little dust for once. Then Croft asked Nora the count of her finished hogs for the year, and she told him the number, and he wrote it down. And Whitmore said, quickly, more quickly than was natural, how did she arrive at that count? He wondered, given that he had been by the county road 2 weeks earlier and estimated the drove at considerably fewer. The silence that followed was specific. Nora looked at Whitmore. Croft looked at Whitmore. The question of how Whitmore knew what the drove had looked like 2 weeks earlier from the county road, and what exactly he had been estimating and why, sat in the air between the 3 of them. Croft wrote something else in his ledger that was probably not about hogs. The assessment came in at a 1/3 increase over the previous figure, which was honest and fair and less than half what Whitmore had clearly hoped for, and Nora's October livestock sales covered the new tax figure and the reserve beside it, with enough left over to purchase the 3 Dowd sows from Pavel's intelligence and to pay Ida Fence father. 4 weeks of fence repair at a wage above what anyone else in the county was currently offering for that work. She noted the Whitmore business in her ledger on the tax page, a single line, and closed the book. Hiram Selke was the one who changed first, publicly, which meant the rest changed behind him the way they always did when Selke moved. He came out to the farm in early November on the pretext of pricing a hog for his own smokehouse, which he could have done at any other farm in the county, and had not, and he stood at the fence of the south field and watched the drove for a time that stretched beyond what you would need for any pricing purpose, and then he said, "Those are Dowd breed." Nora said they were. He said he had always thought Dowd's animals were underestimated. Nora said, yes, and she kept her voice level, because triumph is not for spending in the moment. It is for banking, like a coal, like a certainty, like 60 acres of black soil under a mat of Cocklebur that everyone had decided to sell off cheap. She quoted Selke a fair price, and he bought 2 hogs and drove home and told everyone at the store on Monday. And by the following Saturday she had 4 more buyers at the fence, and she quoted every one of them the same fair price, which was not the scarcity price the drought market would have allowed her. Because she was not the kind of person who needed to take everything the moment offered, and she knew the difference between a windfall and a foundation. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the first one Nora spent with a roof she had put on herself, a full silo, 3 new sows, gestating 20 head of Gruber's cattle in the east pasture growing on her stored grain, and a ledger whose arithmetic had moved, entirely and without drama, from the column of survival into the column of accumulation. She noted the change on a Sunday evening in December, with the lamp burning and the wind off, the plane pressing against the barn walls, and she wrote in the margin of the ledger page, in her careful hand, a thing that was not a calculation but was true. This land teaches, if you stay quiet enough to hear it. It was Pavel's sentence, and she said so. In the margin, it belonged to him. She had only been the student. By March of 1889, Ida Fent was 8 years old, and she had named 44 hogs, and knew each one by the set of its ears. And she came to the farm 4 afternoons a week, and learned every piece of the work Nora would show her, which was all of it, because Nora did not believe in showing a person half a thing. By March, Len Gruber had worked his November agreement, and they had reached a second one, this time in writing, concerning the spring sale of the cattle and the possibility that Gruber might take on 6 of Nora's shoats on a wintering arrangement the following fall, because his ground, now that his debt had been restructured through the county agent's office, was going to be free of the pressure that had made the previous year so hard. And he had begun to think, having watched Nora's south field turn from Cocklebur wasteland to the best blue stem pasture in the county in 18 months, that his own north section, which also had a Cocklebur problem, which most people in the county could not have said without some embarrassment had they thought about it, might benefit from the same treatment. Nora said she thought it would. In April, Calder came back from Salina. He brought a colleague, and the colleague brought an offer sheet, and they both brought the slightly careful manner of city people who have recently learned that a person they underestimated has been busy. They sat on the fence rail. Nora did not invite them to the house, because the conversation she expected to have was better held in the open air, where everyone who drove past on the county road could see that she was having it. And Calder's colleague made a proposal about a standing purchase contract for 60 head per year at a locked price. And the price he named was the fair one, the same one Nora had quoted Calder in April of the previous year. And she said she would want one adjustment in the terms, which was that she retained the right to sell locally, at any time for any reason, because she was not interested in an arrangement that turned her neighbors into a liability. The colleague looked at Calder, and Calder said, "Straighten the terms, as she says," and they shook hands at the fence in the April light, with the hogs turning the east field behind them and the silo rising above the roof of the repaired barn, like a thing that had never doubted itself. Pavel Horak came to the fence that evening as he often did, toward dusk. He was 71 years old, and he had farmed the adjacent 40 acres for 28 years, and he had seen the Cocklebur ground go through 4 owners who had given up on it, and now he was watching it run 60 head of hogs and 20 head of cattle and produce as fine a stand of blue stem as he had seen since the early days. And he looked at all of it for a long time, with his pipe cold in his hand. He said, "I told you the land would teach you." Nora said, "Yes." He said, "You were a good student." She said she had had a good teacher. He knocked his pipe on the fence post and said, "No!" He said, "I told you a thing. The land taught you. There is a difference, and the difference is the land itself." He said, "This is what most people never learn, that a ground others have given up on does not need to be convinced. It only needs someone who will stay." Nora looked out across the south field in the last of the daylight. The turned black earth running all the way to the fence line, the silo at the corner of it, solid as arithmetic, as patience, as 60 acres of certainty that had been sitting under a mat of Cocklebur, waiting for someone to smell the soil and stay. She thought about the $31 and the borrowed wagon and the deed with its dry legal language that could not describe what the land was or what it would do. She thought about Ida Fent naming hogs in the moonlight with the complete authority of a child who does not yet know a thing is supposed to be difficult. She thought about Whitmore's clean boots gathering dust. She thought about Len Gruber with his hat in his hand at the fence line, and the look on his face when she had offered terms he had not expected, and how the offering had felt, not like charity and not like advantage, but like the correct use of a surplus, like the thing the arithmetic had been building toward all along. She did not say any of this to Pavel because it did not need to be said. Some things you bank under the surface and let burn quietly, and the warmth of them reaches further and lasts longer than any fire you could build in the open. The silo stood at the edge of the county road. It was made of fieldstone, laid without mortar, by hands that understood patience. It rose from ground that had been Cocklebur and was now blue stem and turned soil, and the broad backs of hogs moving through the morning light like something the land had always intended to produce, if only someone had been willing to stay and hear it say so. Nora Voss was 26 years old. She had her ledger under her arm and her hands in her coat pockets and 60 acres beneath her feet that the county had sold off for $1 an acre and would not have sold that high if anyone had been watching. She watched the hogs fan out into the last frostbitten field, and she counted them as she always did quietly, the way you count a thing that has come to mean something beyond its number. And when she was done counting, she was satisfied, and she went in to start the morning work, and the land spread out behind her, broad and black and unhurried, doing exactly what it had always been capable of doing, now that someone had stopped shouting long enough to hear it.